This is Exposure Controls Part 2. Part 1 was about apertures, shutter speeds, ISO settings, and their relationship between each other and how they affect the photograph, from blurry motion to shallow depth of field to noise or no noise, right? You know that stuff. This is the second part of this presentation. Okay. All right. So, oh, sorry, jumped back to the beginning of this presentation. Let me flip through the slides. Whenever I go to full view, it jumps to the very first slide. So let me skip ahead. Here we are. Okay, so I made a little video about this. Maybe you looked at it. Hopefully you've looked at your manual. Maybe you already understand these things, but just to make sure. Okay, here are your metering controls on your camera, right? Somewhere on your camera, if you have a point and shoot, a DSLR, a mirrorless, you have a dial that allows you to choose the types of metering, right? M stands for manual. Manual means you have complete control over shutter speed, aperture, ISO, right? You can change them all, okay? A, depending on what brand camera you have, you might have just this A, which stands for aperture preferred or aperture priority. You might have on your camera, it might say AP, some cameras have that. But what it means is that you control the aperture or the lens opening, and the camera will control the shutter speed. So as I change the lens opening, the shutter speed will change correspondingly, or not correspondingly, but indirectly. So if I open up the lens, I'm in a sense closing down the shutter by speeding it up. Okay. With these semi-auto modes like aperture, this is shutter, this is program, the camera, the ISO of the camera is set by you. So I go out to do a shoot, it's a rainy day, maybe I figure I need ISO 800, I set ISO 800, and I forget about it, unless it's not working out, right? So that kind of stays off by itself, but aperture allows you to control the aperture, the camera will change the shutter, okay? S stands for shutter, priority, or it might stand for speed, you know, priority, it depends. Again, camera brands, they won't agree on that kind of thing, but it's close enough that you can figure it out. Okay, shutter priority means that you get to change the shutter speed, you control that, and the camera will change the aperture accordingly, right? So if I set my shutter speed at a 30th of a second and I'm walking down the street in Manhattan and it's kind of bright, you know, the lens will close down. If I then duck into a subway or something like that and it gets dim, even though I still have the shutter speed at a 30th of a second, the lens will open up because the meter will say, hey, we need more exposure, okay? So aperture, A, you control the aperture, camera controls shutter. S, you control the shutter, the camera controls the lens, okay? P, okay, that means basically you set the ISO and then the camera sets aperture and shutter speed, you know, as it determines. And depending on what camera have, you can put some limits on this. You can say to your camera, I don't want my auto shutter speed to get any slower than 1/30th of a second because it might get blurry pictures, that kind of thing. Okay, depending on what camera you have these scene modes, right? And my camera doesn't have those. Yours very well may have them. They're just these various auto modes that presume, like this one up here is portrait. You know, it assumes you want some shallow depth of field. This one's landscape. It assumes you want deep depth of field, so it's going to lean towards closing the lens down. Sports, you know, it assumes that you're shooting action and stuff, so it's going to lean towards a faster shutter speed. Auto, you could use that. You know, if you really don't know what you're about to encounter light-wise and subject matter-wise, and you just want to make sure you get a picture, put it on auto. I never use it, to be honest with you. I just don't use it, and I should maybe more than I, because there are things like you can do what's called shooting from the hip. You know, you're not even looking through your viewfinder, and you see something crazy happening. It happens in an instant. You want to capture it. You don't have time to fiddle with the exposure. So maybe this gets you in the ballpark. Okay, next slide. Okay, so these are going through these various scene types, right? Portrait, landscape, close-up, sports, backlighting is what that is. Okay, and they're automatic presets for your camera. Like I said, portrait is probably shallowed up the field, that kind of thing. Okay, here is backlighting. Now cameras have gotten smarter, with digital sensors and things like face detection. I imagine they also implement something like landscape detection, so it kind of knows what's up. But your camera's meter can get fooled by subject matter where the background is very light and your subject is not, right? The camera can read that and say, oh, there's a lot of light. I better not give this very much exposure. Consequently, your subject, let's say it's like these kids here, it goes into silhouette. Now, to be honest, that's the point of this picture, right? The silhouette is what's working here. But let's say you're taking a picture of your best friend, your mom, or something like that, or and you want to be able to see them. Well, the camera can get fooled by strong, brightly lit backgrounds in a subject matter that's not getting so lit, right? So it takes some practice to kind of prevent that from the outset. We're all taking pictures and looking at the LCD to see whether the exposure is correct. But if you can get some of that in your head, like, oh, this is the kind of scene that has strong backlighting, and already kind of compensate for that, it's helpful. Okay. Conversely, just the opposite. Like it says, this situation creates the opposite complications with metering. Because this case, a great proportion of the picture is very dark. And the camera doesn't know, oh, this is that kind of scene and that's supposed to be dark. It'll just say, hey, this is whatever you're pointing your camera at, it's kind of dark, there's not much light, and it'll overexpose the scene if you're not careful about it. And of course, if you're doing landscape photography and you have the time, you're kind of like, oh, I take a picture, oh, the exposure's wrong, you just correct it. But it's good to understand how your camera can get fooled and to kind of know that from the outset so you can avoid it to some extent to begin with. So if you have a large area in your picture that's dark and the subject that's light, that's not taking up much of the picture, don't expect to get a quote-unquote normal exposure where the little triangle is floating over 0 in the middle of your exposure scale. In this kind of scene, it should be a few clicks looking like it's underexposed. That takes practice, and it's hard to explain in a presentation like this. But just know that your meter, your camera, it doesn't know everything, right? You still have to use your brain and understand lighting situations. Okay, the kind of meter that is in your camera is called a reflective light meter. Depending on what camera you've got, it either has sensors reading light on the mirror, or if you have a mirrorless camera, it's using the sensor itself to figure out how much light is coming through the lens. What the scene is like. It's a reflective light meter. It looks at the scene and it measures the amount of light bouncing off of the tree and the person and the car, And it doesn't know what it's looking at, pretty much. It knows face detection, like I said. I don't know how smart they're getting, with machine learning. I don't know what they detect and don't. They for sure do face, because we have got face recognition, autofocus, that kind of thing. Okay, so a reflective meter designed to average the brightness of a scene, taking into account all degrees of luminance from the darkest to the lightest that are reflecting, that are reaching the meter's sensor, or the sensor itself if you have a mirrorless camera, right? Today's meters are more sophisticated. Now, I can't really, right at this moment anyway, show you what's called an incident light meter. I have a couple of them. They don't measure the amount of light bouncing off of your subject. They measure the amount of light hitting the subject. The problem with reflective light metering, like our cameras use, is that if I wear a white shirt, I'll apparently have a different exposure than if I wear a dark shirt, even though the light stays the same. So even if I change my clothes, when I go to my bright whites, the lighting hasn't changed, but the camera will say, oh, it's very bright out there. But if I switch to my all black shirts and things like that, even if the light doesn't change, the camera will read it and suddenly it gets very dark, right? So that's because the reflectivity of what your camera is pointing at is affecting the light metering, right? So an incident light meter gets around that because it's not metering the reflectivity of your subject, it's measuring the amount of light hitting it. I'm sure that's quite abstract as I describe it verbally. But again, if you're curious about these things, do a search. Reflective light meter versus incident light meter. I'm sure that you can find lots of discussion about that online. Okay, your sensors. My camera is a full frame sensor like this Canon 5D Mark III. Full frame means that the sensor size is the equivalent of 35 millimeter film frame, right? That's kind of like, in a sense, the gold standard, right? 35 millimeter film has been the dominant format for decades. Okay, you see this green box out there, that's a very expensive medium format camera. And it's larger than a full frame 35 millimeter. And the larger the sensor, the more information, the more data, the bigger file you're working with. Right? So if I'm a professional photographer working in a fashion studio, there's a good chance I'm using a Hasselblad like that. It's called a Hasselblad, by the way. But to be honest with you, even these full frame sensors, they have such great resolution, you can be using that as well. You probably have a camera that is a crop sensor camera, right? I imagine. You might have a full frame sensor, they're more and more common, but you probably have a crop sensor. And this is what an iPhone 6 looks like. Okay, so you probably have a phone that has, I don't know, if you have a newish phone, maybe it's got 12, 14, maybe even megapixels, maybe more. But 14 megapixels, and that's the number of pixels in the sensor, the number of light diodes in the sensor. In a tiny little sensor like this, will not have the same image quality as same megapixels spread out over a bigger sensor. Okay, this is kind of getting into the grass of, and you're never going to be tested on this, but maybe if you're kind of tech-minded, you might kind of like this stuff. But you should know that actually that your camera is crop sensor or it's full frame because it affects the way your focal length, the way your lenses work. Okay, this is a basic diagram of a sensor, the way it's built. And different manufacturers do it differently to some extent. But I won't go into this too much. You can linger over it and look at it if you want. Okay. White balance is important. Okay, it's on your camera somewhere. It might be designated with a button that says WB. It might be buried in a menu in your camera, right? Most of you are probably shooting with your white balance set on auto. I do that a lot too, maybe the most. But you do have these other settings. Okay, so here's what white balance does. Okay, white balance calibrates your camera to render white as white in a given lighting condition. So different lighting sources have different what are called color temperatures. Okay, if you're photographing in a room that's all fluorescent lights, it's going to have a different color than a room that is all tungsten light or that is daylight, right? Your camera, when set on auto, it measures that. It kind of estimates, okay, look, given this scene, what do I think these colors look like? And it tries to estimate that to give you proper colors throughout the spectrum. It does an okay job, right? But every time you take a picture, it's doing that again, like figuring out what's the white balance, right? The reason why you have manual settings like daylight, tungsten, fluorescent light, and there's shade, there's stormy weather, right? And it changes the way your picture is affected because of compensating for the different kinds of light. So on a sunny day, midday, and it's sunny, the color temperature measured in Kelvin is 5600 roughly. Okay, it's a bluish light. Okay, it gets even bluer if on that same sunny day you walk into the shade of a building and you photograph somebody in the shade, the light inside shade is cooler, meaning gets bluer, right? So if you switch your white balance to shade, it puts some red in there. It warms it up. Now this only affects JPEGs, okay? Now I haven't talked about JPEG versus RAW, but JPEG means that your camera is going to do some processing on that image before it even gets to your computer, right? So, right, okay, so know where your white balance is. You can use auto if you want. I would encourage you to use some of the manual settings. One of the reasons why they're available is, let's say I'm doing an event and I'm photographing a bunch of people who are in a dining hall and it's all lit with tungsten light, and I'm going to shoot 500 pictures. If I set it on tungsten, if I set my white balance on tungsten, even if it's not completely accurate, maybe it's a little too yellow or something like that, the 500 pictures will be a little too yellow, and I can batch correct them all, right? If I shoot it in auto, there's a chance that the white balance for each picture will be slightly different, so it makes it harder to batch correct. So I've shot 500 pictures of some event, a wedding or something like that, a conference, and if the white balance changes picture to picture, even subtly, skin tone changes, it could be a problem, right? So there are good reasons to have these controls, right? Now there are more controls there than I think I've got listed here. I'm just going on about color temperature and so on. Well, here are some of the ones I just mentioned, right? In my particular camera, I think I have 3 or even 4 different fluorescent settings, right? I do have shade and cloudy, daylight, that kind of thing. This custom one, it's hard to explain verbally. I don't really have a video here to show you that, but you could check that out if you're curious about how to set, like manually set your white balance. And this scale is just showing you, like, okay, here is, daylight, overcast, right? Daylight at noon, right? So as storms come in, as clouds come into the sky, the color temperature gets cooler, and counterintuitively, these numbers go up. The Kelvin numbers go up, despite it getting cooler. Right, tungsten light is down here. It's around 3200. I don't know why that's, it's around 3200. Tungsten light. Fluorescent light is somewhere in here. Fluorescent light's weird. You can get different types of fluorescent light. It's strange. Okay. And this is an example of somebody who's using a flash, and they're playing around with light balance so that they've coordinated their camera with the flash and then let the daylight in the background do something different. Okay, lenses. All right, most of you probably have zoom lenses, maybe a kit lens that came with your camera. You might have fancier lenses. The lenses on the right they can be called prime lenses or fixed focal length lenses. This lens is a 28 millimeter lens only. This lens is a 50 millimeter only. This is an 85 millimeter only. They're fixed focal length. You can't zoom with these lenses. On the right, we've got zoom lenses, right? This is probably a 70, this is a 70 to 200 zoom, 24 to 105, and this is a 16 to 35. These happen to be Canons, these are Nikons, okay? Zoom lenses are relatively new. Not really, they've been around a long time. They started becoming use probably in the 50s. The quality was really poor, right? And it's a big preference for fixed focal length lenses because they're easier to make. Not that they're easy to make, but they're easier than zoom lenses and to make good image quality with them. Still today, people like to use fixed focal length lenses. They're not as convenient as being able to zoom, but they're lighter. They tend to still be sharper and have greater image quality in the corners and the edges, right? So they're still quite popular. I have both fixed and zoom lenses. Okay, a 50 millimeter lens is referred to as the normal focal length. It's the normal lens, 50 millimeter. Why is that? It kind of depicts the world as we see it. The foreground objects appear the same size in relationship to the midground and background, right? It doesn't have to do with the field of view, right? Our eyes, we can see almost 180 degrees. We don't see it sharp, but we can see our hands. Stick out your arms and see how wide you can spread your arms and still see them. Right? It's almost 180 degrees. It's not the field of view is what I'm talking about. It's the relationship between objects in foreground, middle ground, background. They maintain about the same size, scale relationship between each other. When you get to 24 millimeter wide-angle lenses, 20 millimeter, then the foreground gets exaggerated. It becomes larger compared to the background. When you get to zoom, or not zoom, when you get to telephoto lenses, like 135, 200, and so on, the foreground and the background get squished together, and they kind of have a closer size relationship. Okay. Suffice to say, you should know what a normal lens is, 50. And with focal lengths shorter than that, like 24, 20, 18, 16, those are wide-angle lenses. In the other direction, 85, 135, 200, those are telephoto lenses, right? Okay, probably repeating that here. So this is an illustration just showing you, 24 is wide, 35 is a little bit narrower, here's 50, right? It's showing you the different angle of view that these lenses have. This is probably getting into 135 telephotos out here and wide angles out here. Okay, I don't know if you can perceive this, but what I just mentioned, the telephoto lenses, right? They compress the foreground into the background, or both of these, they get compressed together. So the top image is roughly the same composition, as close as I could make it, really. And can you see the difference between this tree and that tree? How they appear to be closer together than with the wide-angle lens, where the distance gets spread further apart, right? So when you change focal length, you're definitely changing field of view, wide to narrow, or narrow to wide, and that's what most people think it's all about, right? Oh, I'm going to change wide-angle lens to get in a wider scene. That is true. But just keep in mind that when you change focal length, you're also changing that distance between the foreground and the background, right? Think of sports. You're watching a soccer game, right? And you've got a TV camera that's pointed all the way down the soccer field using a huge telephoto lens, and it's probably smushing the players together. Right? So feel free to pause and what the hell are you talking about? Check that out and see, right? If you didn't follow my brief description there. All right, I have a blurb here about APS-C sensors, which are crop sensors. They're technically called APS-C crop sensors, right? And they're smaller than 35 millimeter. And what they do effectively is they make the focal length of a lens appear longer. Meaning, if I put a 50 millimeter on a crop sensor camera, it's going to look like basically a 75 millimeter. And people choose those kinds of setups intentionally if they're doing wildlife photography, where they need a telephoto setting. Okay, as I just said, using a telephoto lens makes things look closer. Like this is the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, and that's the Transamerica Pyramid building, and they are miles apart. I don't know what this lens is. It's like I don't know, 500 millimeter lens? I don't know, maybe longer than that. And what the lens is doing is making these two things, the bridge and that building, look closer together than they would. It's like looking through a telescope, basically. It's compressing the distance between these things. Okay, shallow depth of field is another benefit of telephoto lenses, and they're often used in fashion photography or portrait photography, lots of things, So here's somebody modeling a jacket, right? If you put this in a catalog, you don't want people looking at, oh, the cool architecture in the background, I love the windows, and where is that building, right? That's not what you want them looking at. You want them looking at the jacket, right? And the person wearing it, right? So you do that with shallow depth of field. What's that mean? Well, for one thing, open up the lens. Use a small f-stop. 2.8, 3.5. Shift to telephoto lens, that helps. 135, 200, commonly used in fashion. Okay, this is a side note. Really doesn't have to do with lenses so much as just you thinking when you're taking pictures. Okay, don't be satisfied with one picture of anything unless there's no possibility of photographing it twice. But anything you shoot, think about another approach. Change the focal length of your lens. Just move to the left or the right 5 feet, or crouch down, stand up, look for some steps to crawl up. This picture is the same subject, right? Just really seconds apart from each other, photographs seconds apart from each other. But just because I moved a few feet to the left on this one to be a pond, and because I moved a few feet, the reflection in the pond is completely different. So I've gone from kind of a high key picture here, meaning most of the values in the picture are light gray and brighter, to a low key picture. There's a predominance of darker values in the picture, right? So I can't emphasize this enough. Don't be satisfied with one picture. Take a picture of a scene, of a person. Take another picture of that same scene. Change something. If it's a person, change their expression, change the angle of their head or something. If it's a landscape scene, think about objects in the scene. Are they lining up in a weird way? Is there a way that you can move your camera to get things lined up in a cool way, right? Does it change the lighting, right? Maybe you photograph something at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and it's kind of like, who cares, blasé, but maybe it looks great at 5:30, right, in the evening, So, okay, wide-angle lens, gets some distortion a little bit. It does, like it said, it gets a wider field of view. It also stretches the foreground-background relationship. So these objects loom large and the background gets small. Lenses have distortion, right? The two main types of distortion are barrel distortion and pincushion distortion, right? It can be fixed in Photoshop, in any image editor, and in many cases the editor already has what's called a plug-in that automatically fixes that. Or if you're shooting JPEGs in your camera, it's probably being fixed in your camera before it even gets to your computer. But we're going to have a heavy emphasis on shooting raw images. And that means there's no processing done on the image, in the camera anyway. And you get it into Photoshop, and that's where the corrections are made. Okay, but these are the kinds of things that you come across with lenses. Barrel distortion, right? And pincushion distortion, right? Where, like if this is a building, if you're an architectural photographer, you shoot a building and that's what happens to the lines, it can be the end of your career. Of course, it all gets fixed before a client ever sees that, right? There's what it looks like in the real world. Barrel and pincushion. Once again, pincushion. Let me see. I'm going to call that quits here because it's going on quite a while, right? So I'll just let it go at that. Lens distortion, okay? All right, so this presentation has covered lots of stuff, right? It's covered metering modes from manual to shutter priority, aperture priority. It's covered white balance. Again, what is white balance? Oh, it's calibrating the camera to render colors accurate in a given lighting situation or lighting source, fluorescent, tungsten, daylight, stormy weather, that kind of thing. Okay. We also covered focal lengths, wide-angle lenses versus telephoto lenses, right? What's a normal lens? It's a 50 millimeter. What's a wide angle? It's like 20 millimeter, 18 millimeter. Telephoto lens, it's like 135, 200, 400. Those are telephoto lenses. Okay. When you change focal lengths, yeah, you're changing field of view, but you're also changing the relationship of foreground to background. What we could call the z-axis, if you're familiar with that. But it's like, the axis that runs through the lens out into the background. right? You're compressing it or you're stretching it. Okay. Okay, I'm going to stop here. Thanks.